Gernot Rheinstadler was born on August 24th of 1970 in Austria, where skiing was a way of life for many. Growing up in the heart of the Alps, Rheinstadler was introduced to skiing at a young age and quickly developed a natural ability on the slopes. His exceptional talent didn't go unnoticed, and he began competing in local ski races as a child, consistently outpacing his peers. By his teenage years, Rheinstadler had earned a reputation as one of Austria's most promising young skiers. His speed, technique, and fearless style in downhill racing were remarkable, and he quickly progressed through the ranks of junior competitions. Coaches and ski experts alike took note of his potential, and it wasn't long before he was invited to join the Austrian national team at just the age of 20. That opportunity meant he'd get to compete in the qualifying rounds of the Laberhorn ski races, also known as the Laberhorn Alpine Ski World Cup. These races are huge, attracting around 30,000 spectators every year, making them some of the most watched winter sports events in the world. Laberhorn is a mountain in the Bernese Alps of Switzerland, sitting between Wingen and Grindelwald, just north of the Kleinschleidig. It peaks at an elevation of 2,472 meters or 8,110 feet above sea level. The downhill course here is the longest in the world too, stretching over 4.4 kilometers or 2.7 miles, which means runs take about 2.5 minutes, roughly 30 to 45 seconds longer than typical downhill races. In other words, it's the perfect stage for a fierce showdown between skiers from all over the globe. Each year, the skiers with the highest overall points and World Cup rankings get an automatic spot in the competition. However, up-and-coming talents get their shot through the qualifying rounds or training rounds that happen before the actual World Cup kicks off. Rheinstadler joined these training sessions in January, just a few weeks before the 1991 World Cup was set to begin. But what lay ahead was so terrifying it not only led to the cancellation of that year's World Cup, but also changed the way downhill skiing was approached as a sport forever. On January 19th, a crowd gathered to watch him race down the slope, showing off his acrobatics during one of his training runs. The spectators cheered, clapped, and whipped out their cameras to capture his impressive skills. But just moments later, those cameras recorded something that would make everyone's skin crawl. As Rheinstadler hit the final stretch of the slope, he was barreling along at around 50 miles or 80 kilometers per hour. He needed to make a sharp right turn, but for a split second, his focus wavered. He stumbled in the snow, and at that speed, he crashed into the safety nets ahead. While the impact wasn't fatal, what went terribly wrong was the structure of the nets. They had huge holes in it. His sled's sharp end got caught in one of those holes, trapping his right leg. Meanwhile, his body continued hurtling down the slope at the same horrifying speed, tearing his legs from his lower abdomen. Overwhelmed by the pain, Rheinstadler lost consciousness and slid down the final stretch to the finish. Responding to the emergency, the medical teams jumped into action right away. They got to him fast and started giving him oxygen to stabilize him, and then they airlifted him off the mountain with a helicopter, rushing him straight to the hospital, where he went into surgery. His pelvis was shattered and his right leg was nearly torn off. Despite the intense effort, including multiple transfusions and a grueling 6-hour surgery, he unfortunately ended up passing away the same day. As the horrifying accident left the skiing world in shock, the 1991 Laberhorn race was abruptly called off. The Austrian team, reeling from the tragedy, packed up and left without a word. This disaster came on the heels of a heated debate over the proposed qualification system, which critics had warned would push young racers like Rheinstadler to the brink, risking their safety in a desperate bid to qualify. The accident also intensified the scrutiny of safety on downhill courses, leading to some major changes, including making the holes in safety nets smaller to prevent skis from being entangled and causing such tragedies in the future. The day after Thanksgiving, November 27th of 2009, a family's joyful reunion in Council Bluffs, Iowa, had just gone wrong. Over the dinner table, an argument broke out, escalating into a heated verbal clash between the parents and their son, Larry ElMonata. In a fit of rage, the 25-year-old stormed out of the house, barefoot and in the middle of a blizzard. He left behind his phone and car keys with no warm clothes to protect him from the cold. While the parents were naturally worried, Larry had pulled similar stunts before, always returning after a few hours, so they expected he'd come back this time as well. However, he didn't. The parents waited all night, but when he didn't show up, their concern turned into unease. Larry's father and a family friend went out searching for him, but despite their efforts, they came up empty-handed. The family then contacted the police, who launched a search that lasted several days, then weeks, and eventually months, but Larry seemed to have vanished without a trace. It wasn't until 10 years later that they discovered his whereabouts less than a mile away from his house, except that he was found in a way that was not only horrific, but also very strange. After his family moved from Honduras in Central America to the United States, when he was young, he never quite adjusted to his new surroundings. What started as a concern grew worse over time, and by the time he hit 25, he was dealing with some pretty serious mental health issues. He was prescribed antidepressants, but their effectiveness was inconsistent. Sometimes they helped, but other times they only piled on more frustration and anxiety. To make things worse, he had a bunch of side effects that seemed to make his condition even more challenging. He'd often talk about experiencing hallucinations, like feeling as if someone was chasing him or hearing a strange voice in his head telling him to eat sugar. He also struggled with cardiac arrhythmia and believed that eating sugar would somehow make it go away. While this was a pretty difficult situation, there was one place where Larry found a bit of solace: the supermarket where he worked. There was something about that place that seemed to soothe him. Maybe it was the friends, or perhaps the environment. Whatever it was, Larry spent more time there than at home, which didn't go unnoticed by his family. After his Thanksgiving shift on November 27th of 2009, he came home feeling pretty out of sorts. His parents tried to help him out, and the family sat down at the dinner table to chat, but Larry wasn't having any of it. He started arguing with his parents, and things quickly escalated into a heated situation. Frustrated and angry, Larry stormed out of the house in the middle of a heavy snowstorm. He was only wearing a navy blue hoodie and light blue pants, which would do nothing to protect him from the freezing cold. To make it harder for his parents to follow him, he left his car keys and cell phone behind. His parents, though, who were used to him running off but always coming back, didn't panic right away. They waited through the night, but when Larry still didn't show up, they started to worry. Larry's father, along with one of his close friends, set out to find him. They combed the area, reached out to his other friends, and when that didn't work, they put up missing person flyers around the neighborhood. Eventually, they went to the police and filed a report. For the next several months, authorities were relentless in their search for the missing guy. What started as a routine operation quickly turned into one of the most baffling cases ever. They even considered the possibility that he'd been kidnapped or worse. Despite their best efforts, every lead seemed to fizzle out. Eventually, after years of dead ends, the case was put on hold. Larry's heartbroken parents had to come to terms with the gut-wrenching reality that they may never know what happened to their son that night. No one had answers for nearly a decade until January 24th of 2019. On that day, just under a mile from Larry's house, the supermarket where he had worked at was being cleared out. The place had been closed for 3 years, and on January 24th, a team of workers were sent to remove the shelves and freezers. While going about their work, the crewmen had no idea they were about to stumble upon something truly unexpected among the items. Behind one of the 4-meter or 13-foot tall freezers, a decaying mummified human body was found stuffed at a weird angle. The crew totally freaked out and called the cops right away. Since the body was way too decomposed for a visual ID, they sent it off for a DNA test. That's when the police dug up Larry's missing persons case from 10 years ago and matched the clothes of the body with what he was reported to be wearing when he disappeared. The following week, the DNA test confirmed it was him, dead and rotting away for a whole decade. The big question now was how the 25-year-old ended up stuck there. At first they thought maybe someone had killed him and hidden the body, but the autopsy showed no signs of physical trauma, so that theory was quickly ruled out. After a lot of thinking, investigators finally came up with an explanation for the strange turn of events on the day Larry went missing. Following the heated argument with his parents, Larry went back to the store where he'd just finished his shift a few hours earlier. Since he was off the clock, no one knew he was there. The 25-year-old climbed up onto the giant refrigerators in the storage area, which was a space typically used for stock, but also where employees would hang out during breaks. Larry sat there for a while trying to calm down before he somehow slipped behind the massive machines into a narrow gap at an awkward angle. Once trapped, Larry's situation became dire. He began screaming and crying out for help, but his pleas went unnoticed. The store was noisy, and with the giant freezers humming and clinking, it drowned out his desperate cries. As the hours passed, Larry suffered from severe dehydration and suffocation and died in that horrific, claustrophobic space just a few feet away from his coworkers who remained blissfully unaware of his ordeal. Over time, his body left in the cramped, dark gap began to undergo the mummification process due to the dry conditions of the storage area. The place was already known for its unpleasant odors, so the smell of his decaying body didn't stand out to the employees, who had become desensitized to such odors over time. The customers, though, who entered the portion of the store noticed a foul smell, but couldn't have imagined the dead body was hidden behind a freezer. Larry's body remained hidden for 7 years while the store was still open. After the store closed, it stayed there for another 3 years before the horrifying discovery was finally made. Yellowstone National Park is hands down one of the biggest and most active geothermal areas on the planet. With bubbling hot springs, steaming geysers, scorching fumaroles, and mud spots that dot the landscape, it hosts more than 10,000 thermal features across its expansive terrain. And just like others of its kind, this activity is also driven by a massive volcanic system beneath the Earth's surface, which time and time again heats these water bodies, keeping the groundwaters boiling. Some of these steaming hot springs can hit over 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 93 degrees Celsius under certain conditions. Take the Celestine Pool for example. It usually sits at about 183 degrees Fahrenheit or 84.1 degrees Celsius. But with a little seasonal change or tectonic shift, it can crank up to 205 degrees Fahrenheit or 96 degrees Celsius. Due to such conditions, while these springs are straight up dangerous and definitely not the place you'd want to be hanging around, they're also insanely beautiful, so those views still end up drawing in big crowds. For over a century, there have been 22 reported deaths from scalding in the park's hot springs, and it seems like that number might just keep climbing in the future. On July 20th of 1981, 23-year-old David Allen Kerwin and 25-year-old Ronald Ratliff were cruising across Yellowstone National Park in their truck. They were about 1,000 miles away from their hometowns and had to cross the park to keep their road trip going. But after 15 hours on the road, they were beaten, and Ronald's Great Dane, Muzi, was restless and frustrated from being cooped up in the truck for too long. Given Muzi's large size, the dog needed to stretch out and move around now and then, so they figured Yellowstone's stunning scenery would be a perfect spot to pull over and unwind. Around 1 p.m., they parked at the secluded hot spring, which still had a few people around it. Located in the lower geyser basin of the park, it was called the Celestine Pool, named after the rare mineral found there. The water was incredibly hot, and everyone knew better than to get too close, so they kept their distance. David and Ronald hopped out of the truck and opened the back seat to let their dog out. The animal was so excited that it leaped out and took off running before they could even get a leash on it. The guys weren't too worried though, as the dog was pretty well mannered and they knew it wouldn't wander off too far. So while it enjoyed its run around the field, the exhausted duo decided to take a walk to the pool. Even though it was peak summer, Yellowstone had awesome, pleasant weather, and the geothermal pool added just the right touch of warmth to the air. After soaking in the beautiful scenery for a bit, David glanced back at his dog, and sure enough, it was coming back. But then came crashing down an event that sent shivers down their spines. The playful dog messing around with them once again ran past the duo, this time straight towards the boiling water. Before they could react, it accidentally leaped into the scalding hot spring. The splash was so jarring that people, including David and Ronald, screamed in horror. David was beside himself, unable to stand by and watch the nightmare unfold. Desperate to save the poor animal but unsure of how to help, he ended up making a mistake that only made things worse. The 23-year-old decided to take the plunge and pull the animal out. As he got ready to step in, the crowd around the chaotic scene started shouting again, begging him not to go. But David, locked in on the dog's struggle, shot back with a firm refusal. He took a few steps into the scalding water, though with all the adrenaline pumping, it didn't feel too bad at first. Then he braced himself, closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and jumped in head first. That's when it hit him. He'd made a terrible mistake. The second his skin touched the water, it was like 1,000 needles stabbing him at once. The heat rushed through him, starting in his head and working its way through every inch of his body, setting him on fire from the inside out. His eyes, even though they were squeezed shut, burned from the heat around him, but he still fought through it, splashing his arms and legs for a few seconds, grabbing the dog and trying to make his way back. The pain, though, was too much. When he opened his eyes, the boiling water blinded him. He couldn't tell which way to go and went under again for a few seconds. When he came back up, the dog was gone, but now it wasn't even about the dog anymore. He was trying to save his own life. His arms were barely hanging on, but he kept on flailing, desperately trying to make it to shore. Back on shore, Ronald, already losing it, screamed and jumped feet first into the shallow water, yanking him out while burning his own legs in the process. A few people rushed over, pulling David to the side and shouting for help. David was screaming in pain, cursing himself repeatedly for going in. His condition was beyond horrible. He couldn't see, and his skin was ghost white. Once the medics got to him, the body was assessed as being 100% covered in third-degree burns up to the bones, while Ronald had second-degree burns on his feet. David endured several agonizing hours as the intense pain from the burns ravaged his body before he finally succumbed to death the next morning. And the dog he had risked his life for probably got swallowed up by the boiling water, as nobody went back to look for it. It's August 7th of 2016. Nathan Schwab, the 12-year-old son of Kansas State Representative Scott Schwab, is all fired up standing outside the pool of the largest slide in the world. He's just gone down the massive ride himself, and now he's waiting for his 10-year-old brother to follow. The two had climbed to the top together, but at the last minute they split up with Nathan going first, while his brother sat to come after him, sitting beside two other passengers. The 2 seconds drag on, each one feeling like an eternity. Nathan's excitement shifts to unease. His eyes are locked on the mouth of the slide, expecting to see his brother any moment now, laughing or maybe a little winded, but instead what comes next freezes him in place. The Schlitterbahn Kansas City Water Park authorities in 2012 were in a tough spot. The Great Recession from 2007 to 2009 had hit them hard, and their much-hyped grand opening on July 15th of 2009 was a total letdown, leaving them struggling to draw any attention for the entire inaugural season. In the next couple of years, they started making some progress, but things were still pretty rough and filled with all kinds of unpleasant surprises. So, to turn the situation around and get more people through the gates, the park's owner and his co-founder cooked up what they thought would be a brilliant plan. In November of 2012, they announced that they were going to build the world's tallest and fastest water slide, which they would break the Guinness World Record. The owner himself came up with the design and concept, but when he pitched it to the manufacturers, they weren't exactly sold on the idea, so they decided to build it themselves, a move that seemed sketchy from the start. In their rush to get this massive slide out there, Schlitterbahn's in-house crew worked around the clock, sometimes forcing the staff to give extra hours. Calculations that normally required 3 to 6 months were crammed into just 5 weeks, and in less than a year they had it ready for testing. By November 2013, the ride had a name, Verrückt, which fittingly meant crazy or insane in German. The testing, though, turned out to be another headache because the design had some major issues. The rafts used to slide down the ride kept going airborne on this massive uphill slope towards the bottom of the slide, which forced the manufacturing team to go back and make some significant changes. But everything was moving too fast because the owners were rushing to meet the promised opening date. After 9 months of readjusting things, the parks team claimed it was good to go once again. The Guinness Book of World Records named Verrückt the tallest slide in the world in April of 2014, even though it wasn't fully prepared yet. Standing at 51.4 meters or 168.7 feet, it was taller than Niagara Falls and broke the previous record held by Kilimanjaro in Brazil. But the same old issue was still there. Although it wasn't as bad as before, the rafts were still catching air on the way down. So just days before the grand opening, they had a few staff members test and redesign it over and over. But with the clock ticking and the pressure on, they couldn't fully solve the problem, however they managed to dial it down a bit. To play it safe, they covered the whole thing in a metal netting, so if a raft went airborne, it wouldn't fly off the slide. While they did call it a solution, it was more of a band-aid fix. Still, they got the ride open, and as expected, Verrückt became an instant sensation, shooting the park's popularity through the roof. For the next 2 years, the ride pulled in crowds from all over the world, raking in millions for the owners. But on and off, there were reports of rafts going airborne at the same spot on the slide. The park's management got the warnings, but they didn't do anything about it, even though they totally could have. That level of negligence was deadly, and the consequences were going to be just as horrifying. On August 7th of 2016, Schlitterbahn Water Park held Elected Officials Day. It was pretty much a marketing stunt where they gave free entry to elected officials and their families. Among those who took up on the offer was Kansas State Representative Scott Schwab, along with his wife and 4 kids. The kids were all young and naturally were super excited for the rides, especially Verrückt. The Schwabs went to church that morning, packed up the car, and headed to the park for a day of fun. Once they got there, the 2 boys, 12-year-old Nathan and 10-year-old Caleb, dashed for the rides one after another, laughing and loving every minute of their adventure. The boys then set their sights on the world's tallest slide and told their dad they were going to try it. Scott advised them to stick together as they headed towards the climbing platform. He and his wife, Michelle, were chilling and keeping an eye on the younger kids from a distance. Meanwhile, Nathan and Caleb climbed up 264 stairs to get to the Viaduct. At the top, they met the ride operator who asked them to step on a scale. Both boys met the age and height requirements for the ride. The operator then sorted out the weight limits for the rafts and split them into 2 groups. Each raft could hold 3 people, so Nathan and Caleb ended up in separate rafts with 2 other passengers each. They didn't mind too much since the ride was only supposed to take a few minutes and they'd be back together at the bottom. Little did they know that wasn't going to happen. The ride's dispatch signal went green, and the operator told them it was free for them to take the plunge. Nathan's raft went first, and he told his brother he'd be waiting for him down at the end. The operator gave the raft a push, and with a burst of loud, thrilling screams, Nathan and the group shot down the slide. After a wild few minutes, he popped out of the slide and started waiting for his brother's raft. Back at the top of the boarding platform, the signal turned green again, and this time, Caleb, along with 2 other sisters, Hannah Barnes and Matraka Bates, took the plunge. The ride kicked off in much of the same way, but the excitement hit a peak as they sped down the first hill, hitting a whopping 70 miles or 112 kilometers per hour. Then they tackled the second hill, where the raft slid up at a high speed before dropping down an even steeper slope, but that's where it spiraled into a terrifying disaster. As the raft shot up the hill, it went airborne and crashed into the metal netting above. Caleb, sitting up front, took the worst hit. His neck slammed into one of the poles, and he was decapitated instantly. The 2 sisters sitting behind him suffered severe facial injuries as well, including a broken jaw and other fractures, but they fortunately survived. Hearing what happened, Scott and Michelle rushed to the scene, but people who saw Caleb's condition stopped them, saying it was far too heartbreaking of a scene for parents to witness. The first responders didn't even attempt to revive Caleb, they knew he was already gone. Soon after this, a park official approached the devastated couple and confirmed their son's death, urging them again not to view his body. Following the incident, the park was shut down immediately, and a major investigation kicked off. The research teams carefully examined the ride's structure and quickly discovered a serious design flaw in the second hill, where rafts frequently went airborne. The safety nets, instead of helping, turned out to be as deadly as the raft had just fallen off. There might have been a chance Caleb could have survived if there were no sharp poles at the impact spot. It was also revealed that Kansas allowed water parks to self-inspect, meaning the park was in charge of its own construction and safety testing without any external government oversight. Between August 31st, 2014 and August 5th, 2016, 11 ridegoers had reported injuries on the ride due to the airborne issue, yet the park's management not only ignored these complaints, but also failed to address the major design flaw. As the investigation wrapped up, the park's co-owner, the top design expert, and the general contractor were hit with second-degree murder charges, while the park manager faced manslaughter charges for hiding past incidents. 47-year-old Keith Masters and his girlfriend were heading out of their apartment, making their way down the building's hallway on Friday, December 13th of 2002, when they ran into their friend Kyle McGarity. Kyle, a 25-year-old bartender, had just finished his shift and was ready to start his weekend getting into the holiday spirit for Christmas. Though the 2 friends had a bit of an age difference, still Keith and Kyle clicked along very well, and living in the same building, they frequently found themselves hanging out together. So seeing Kyle that night, Keith jumped at the chance to invite him for drinks. Kyle was up for it, and the trio headed to the pub just down the street in Lower Manhattan. Reaching there, they had a blast and drank a lot, but on the way back, Keith started to think his friend was hitting on his girlfriend. Whether it was actually happening or if the drunk middle-aged guy just imagined it, no one could say for sure. What we do know is that Keith ended up confronting Kyle, accusing him of making moves on his girlfriend. Kyle denied it, and things quickly escalated into a full-blown brawl. Keith, being 20 years older and way stronger, gave his 25-year-old friend quite a beating. It was the weekend and the roads were packed with people. According to several witnesses, Kyle was getting tossed around like a rag doll and repeatedly slammed to the ground. He was begging Keith to stop, saying his leg was about to break, but Keith wasn't backing down. Just a few meters away from the situation, there was an open manhole. A few days earlier, a private gas and steam utility company had been alerted about a leak in an access point to a steam main buried below that manhole. The workers had been scrambling to find and fix the problem. The 4.5 meter or 15-foot deep manhole was flooded with scalding hot water and steam. The job wasn't finished yet, so the workers had put a temporary cover over the manhole with a plastic vent stack. But somehow it wasn't there at that time. In a fit of rage, Keith grabbed Kyle and, without a second thought, dragged him over to the manhole and threw him in. Inside the manhole, it was like being thrown into a pot of scalding stew, only with 3 times the heat. The water was boiling at 572 degrees Fahrenheit. Kyle was in excruciating pain as he was literally being cooked alive. By the time this nightmare unfolded, it was 4 a.m., and his frantic screams echoed from the hole, prompting people nearby to call the cops. The first officer who arrived on the scene tried to check on him, but the steam was so blisteringly hot that it was almost impossible to stand near the manhole, let alone help Kyle. Realizing the gravity of the situation, firefighters in full protective gear were summoned to get a better look at the horrific situation. Kyle was waist deep in the boiling water, his hands were up, and he was desperately trying to get help. Despite their protective gear, the firefighters couldn't safely descend because of the extreme heat, so they tossed him a rope, hoping he could somehow manage to tie it around himself so they could pull him out. But by then, Kyle's muscles were starting to paralyze, and he couldn't grab the rope. The police had reached out to the hot water supplier company, asking them to shut off the main line. However, the steam was still there, and it could take hours to cool down, so all they could do was wait. After nearly 4 hours trapped in the inferno hole, Kyle's agonizing cries eventually fell silent. When they finally managed to retrieve his body, the report revealed even more horrifying details about his final moments. The medical examiner who conducted the autopsy described that Kyle had been steamed like a lobster. Experts pointed out that steam burns, no matter how severe, don't destroy nerve endings like flames do. This means Kyle would have felt every bit of pain until he lost consciousness. And given that steam at a certain temperature feels much hotter than boiling water, his ordeal was likely far more painful than anyone could have imagined. Keith Masters, the guy who threw Kyle down the well, was initially charged with second-degree murder, but those charges were dropped for undisclosed reasons. Kyle's family also tried to sue the utility company whose workers had been fixing the manhole, but that lawsuit didn't go through either. The company had supposedly closed the manhole properly, but somehow the cover went missing, and unfortunately led to tragedy.